Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Kate Williamson, and I'm a pediatrician and the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics Orange County chapter. And I am honored to bring to you today one of our leading infectious disease doctors who will be talking about the COVID-19 vaccine and answering questions that you might have. Dr. Jasjit Singh, a pediatric infectious disease specialist at CHOC, has been working tirelessly since the pandemic started to keep our medical community informed and to keep our kids and our Orange County community safe. I have asked her to join us in this video so that every teacher, community leader, and parent understands the science of the COVID-19 vaccine. And together, we can vaccinate Orange County and get our kids back to school and back to sports safely. Dr. Singh, thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you, Kate. I'm really glad to be here and talk about vaccines and answer some questions. So we'll jump right in, and I'm going to start off with some basic epidemiology. Unfortunately, you can see the numbers here. In our country, we have now surpassed 560,000 deaths. In California, approaching 60,000 deaths. Here in our little Orange County, almost 5,000 deaths. And honestly, if you'd asked me at the beginning of this pandemic if we would ever be encountering numbers like this, I would have been appalled. So I really do want to talk about vaccines as an important method to help us get out of this pandemic and get our lives back. One of the first questions that I encounter is, gosh, this went very fast, this whole timeline. How does that affect us, and what does that mean in terms of our vaccines? And yes, it was a very fast process. The virus was sequenced, and we had a vaccine within a year. So traditionally, we have our steps for our vaccine approval in a very sequential way. And what's different in these accelerated approaches, and we have done these types of accelerated approaches before, for instance, when we needed to make a vaccine against polio, is that instead of having every step in sequence, we can start to do some of these steps in parallel. And what that means then is that some of the steps can start before the other steps have actually been completed. So this doesn't mean, though, of course, that any of the steps have been skipped or truncated. It just means that we have been able to telescope the whole process. So why don't we do this all the time? Well, it's expensive. If we set up manufacturing before the vaccine is known to work and be approved, that's a significant financial outlay in case things don't work out. But it really does accelerate the whole process. So once again, steps were not skipped or truncated. They were just telescoped and done in parallel rather than just sequentially. Let's start with the vaccine overview. I want to let everyone know that the end goal here is the same, no matter which vaccine or vaccine platform. Our goal here is to make an immune response and antibodies to that spike protein that everybody has heard about. Traditionally, we might start over here with a protein subunit vaccine. So what does that mean? It means that we give the body a spike protein, and the body generates antibodies and immune immune responses to it. This is actually being done by one of the companies, and that vaccine is known as Novavax. It hasn't been approved yet, though. What we are familiar with now are the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. And what's different here is that the body is not receiving the spike protein. The body is receiving the instructions on how to make the spike protein. After it does that, then it can generate those same immune responses. So in these cases, that mRNA, or naked genetic material as it's called, is fairly unstable. So it's put into what's called a lipid nanoparticle to get it delivered to those cells. Kind of think of it as a nice fatty gift bag that the cell can receive in order to start generating that spike protein and then have the body make the immune response. Another way to do that is with viral vector vaccines. And in these cases, the package that's being delivered is in the form of an adenovirus or other viral vector. Adenoviruses are common cold viruses. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine uses a human adenovirus, and the AstraZeneca vaccine uses a chimpanzee adenovirus. And in both cases, these viruses are non-replicative, which means that they cannot be replicating and making other copies in the body. And these are common cold viruses. Once again, the end result is the same. We want the body to make spike protein, and then we will generate that immune response to it. So people are concerned that these are newer platforms and that they haven't been used in commercial vaccines before. But it's important to remember that these platforms have actually been studied for decades and have been evaluated for other pathogens. And the other piece I found that people are worried about is that maybe this is somehow going to alter my own genetic material. So it's important to remember that not only are these vaccines not containing live virus, they cannot give you COVID, but they also are actually not entering the cell nucleus, which you'll remember is where your DNA resides. So if they can't get into your cell nucleus where your DNA is, they can't alter it. So that mRNA, as I mentioned, is very unstable. It's really gotten rid of pretty quickly by the body after it's used. The good thing about these vaccines are that they're very nimble, they enable fast production, they're less costly to make, and they can be adapted quickly if we have to for variants or for other reasons. So after we had the first mRNA Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, everyone knows that the next vaccine that's been approved is Johnson & Johnson. What's nice about this vaccine is that it's a single dose, and the storage requirements are actually much less onerous. This vaccine had a 72% efficacy rate in the US studies, but what's important is that it had a much higher efficacy against hospitalization. And when you think about it, really in the end, that's what you want. You're not as worried about getting disease if it's mild, you have a cold, you're in bed for a couple days at home. What you really want to prevent is being admitted to the hospital and being on a ventilator. And so this vaccine as well is really good at preventing that. The side effect profile does seem to be pretty similar in terms of common side effects, but I will mention, because it's just happened in the last few days, that there have been reports of an entity called cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, or blood clots in the brain. The report is of 6 women aged 18 to 48 years old in the US. So this is a serious complication, but it's exceedingly rare. And I think that's the important piece right now today. This occurred in less than 1 per 1 million doses of vaccine administration. So less than if your risk of getting hit by lightning, say. Very, very rare, but serious. And so our professional societies that evaluate vaccine safety, like the ACIP, Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, will be looking at this in the next several weeks and coming to some conclusions about how we need to address this. There are also some good CDC guidelines about what else we need to consider when we're giving the mRNA vaccines, which have been the ones that have been most extensively used in the US. And I won't go through all of this, but I think the important piece are updated quarantine recommendations if you've been vaccinated. And that's been really nice because fully vaccinated persons who meet criteria for a full vaccination no longer have to be quarantined following exposure because you're protected. So I think that we're seeing now recommendations that help us feel good about getting vaccinated and being able to help return to a normal life. Co-administration with other vaccines, there's also a lot of new data coming out. Right now, because of lack of really other data, the recommendation has been to wait 14 days between COVID vaccines and other vaccines. However, if you do need a vaccine in the intervening period for a serious reason, say a tetanus-prone wound, then you need to get that. And I think as time goes on, this recommendation may change. And in some ways, that'll be helpful because in the fall, we're anticipating people may need this vaccine as well as flu vaccine. Kids may need other vaccines for school. So we're hoping that this will be reevaluated with more data and that we can think about giving some vaccines concurrently. Another question that people frequently have is, well, what if I've had COVID? What does that mean now in terms of vaccination? So we do know that vaccine is recommended whether or not you've had COVID in the past. Certainly, it should be deferred until you're out of isolation. But otherwise, it does appear from the data that we have so far that your immune response is actually more robust after vaccination than after natural infection, particularly if it was mild. So we definitely are recommending vaccination even if you've had COVID. We're not recommending that you have vaccine titers or serologic testing before you get vaccinated, or that should influence your vaccine decision. If you'd like, you can wait 90 days until you get vaccinated with the idea that you probably have some short-term protection. But after that, you certainly should be vaccinated. Those people who have received monoclonal antibodies, those people should wait 90 days before they get their COVID vaccine. People have had a lot of questions about, well, what if I have an underlying medical condition? What does that mean for me in terms of my COVID vaccine? So the clinical trials did include people with underlying medical conditions. However, there really isn't a whole lot of data about safety and efficacy. I think, though, that really what we're talking about is efficacy more than safety. The safety profile looks like it's pretty similar, especially for immunocompromised individuals. But the efficacy data, we really don't know how effective exactly the vaccines will be. Are they as effective as in normal healthy persons? Maybe less so, but they probably do offer some degree of protection. For autoimmune conditions, there hasn't been any safety signal raised that these vaccines will spark or set off autoimmune conditions if people have them. So that's something that's being monitored carefully. And for some of these other conditions, there is no reason to defer vaccination. So what contraindications do exist for vaccination? Severe allergic reactions to the vaccine or any of its components. Precautions: any severe or immediate allergic reaction to a vaccine or other injectable therapy. And sometimes, if that's the case, it's good to speak with your allergist and have that evaluated more thoroughly. I think what's more important are the more routine questions related to allergies to things in our environment: foods, pets, medications. And so these are not considered either contraindications or precautions to vaccination. But what should happen is that you should be monitored for a little bit longer if you have a history of one of these severe allergic reactions. So we'd like you to wait 30 minutes and be observed after you get your vaccine. And as a reminder, these vaccines do not contain eggs or gelatin. What about other less common reactions? We've heard about delayed onset local reactions. You can see in the picture here. These can be pretty impressive in terms of large amounts of redness and swelling, maybe some pain. These occur a few days to a week or two out from your vaccine, and these also are not considered contraindications or precautions to receive your second dose. You should do it at the recommended interval. If you can get it in the other arm, that's great. And it may or may not happen with the second vaccine. That data is still being accumulated. Fortunately, this also is a short-lived reaction. public health recommendations after vaccination, I think everyone has heard that certainly for the time being, vaccinated persons should continue to follow the current guidance regarding masking, physical distancing, avoiding crowds, and washing their hands. And these non-pharmaceutical interventions we know are very effective, and for the time being, we're going to need to continue with those. However, if you have been vaccinated and you do get exposed within 3 to 6 months now after your vaccination, you do not have to quarantine. And certainly you continue to monitor for symptoms and do all of those other things, but it really does allow for some degree of confidence and a feeling that you are safer after you've been vaccinated. There are lots of other tables and data about vaccination, side effects, almost quirky things that might happen during the vaccination process. If some of your vaccine dose leaks out, if you got a different product than the first time, all kinds of other contingencies have been looked at, and those guidance tables are in the documents. They've been very helpful. What about safety and more short-term and long-term side effects? Well, I think that everybody knows that we definitely do see some short-term side effects with these vaccines. Local side effects are not that different from other vaccines, some arm soreness. A good percentage of people, though, do have some systemic side effects, meaning they may have a headache, muscle aches, maybe even some fever and chills, particularly after that second dose. Fortunately, once again, these side effects are really short-lived. They dissipate after 1 to 2 days, and you can go about and be back to your regular routine. What about variants? There's a lot in the news right now about variants. Well, I think that what we really need to remember, the big picture here, is that if people are vaccinated, we can stop the virus from replicating. And viruses do mutate when they replicate. That's very common for these RNA viruses. But the virus can't mutate if it's not replicating. So that's what we have to remember. If we can stop the virus from replicating by having our population immune, we can stop the variants from being formed. And that's important because as we get more and more of these variants, they will escape coverage from our vaccination. So we want to get people vaccinated before that can happen. And we'd like to get to 70 to 85% population immunity in order to achieve herd immunity that's so important. What about pregnant women? I think this is always a concern, and we don't start off vaccine trials including pregnant women. But of course, some women will turn out to be pregnant or become pregnant during vaccine trials. So we do have a little bit of data. We also know that pregnant women who get COVID-19 are more likely to suffer severe disease, intensive care unit admission, and have a greater risk of death than age-matched women who are not pregnant. So we know that disease may be more severe for women who are pregnant. The risk of COVID to the fetus seems to be low and very rare. And the important thing to remember is that, as I said, mRNA vaccines in particular are very unstable, the mRNA portion of it. So they get picked up locally by cells and then rapidly degraded, as I mentioned earlier. So the ability for that mRNA to reach the placenta, cross it, and get to the baby is very low. On the other hand, I will say, though, as mom makes antibodies, those antibodies can cross the placenta and may theoretically provide some protection to the baby. And we do that with other vaccines like whooping cough or tetanus. And those transplacental antibodies, as we call them, can be very protective. I'll also add that for breastfeeding women, vaccine seems to be safe, and vaccination is encouraged for breastfeeding moms. Another question that's come up frequently from younger women is vaccine causing infertility. So the short answer is the biologic plausibility of this vaccine causing infertility seems to be very, very low. The longer answer, I think, that people have heard about on social media is that there is some cross-reactivity with a protein called syncytin 1, and that this is a protein that is in early placental development. And there are some protein sequences that are shared, but these are very, very short sequences. The analogy I've heard one of my OBGYN colleagues use is that if you and your friend have phone numbers that share the number 7, how likely is it really that your phone numbers are going to be confused? That's the amount of homology that we're talking about. And we also know that natural infection is not causing infertility. And we know from the earlier trials that about an equal number of women in both the vaccine and placebo arms became pregnant. So I think the evidence that these vaccines could impair fertility is really non-existent, and as I mentioned, is really not biologically plausible. How about mammography for women? Well, we do know that swollen lymph nodes can occur after getting COVID-19 vaccination under the same arm where you got that vaccine. And that's part of the immune system revving up and working. Another sign, like some of the other side effects, that the vaccine is working and your immune system is responding. So because of that, it is recommended that if you have a regular screening mammogram, that you might want to defer your mammogram 4 to 6 weeks after your second dose of COVID-19 vaccination, so that that swollen lymph node doesn't cause any confusion. If you are, though, having a diagnostic mammogram and timing is important, you should go ahead and do that. Now let's jump a little bit into pediatric vaccines. The first question is really, why do we need to do that? Well, we do know that children get severe disease less often, but it still happens. I can tell you here at CHOC, we have admitted almost 500 kids with COVID, and we've had some severe disease, particularly in those with underlying medical problems. We've also had about 75 children who have experienced multisystem inflammatory syndrome, C, children, and that has also been sometimes very severe disease with good diagnostic and therapeutic challenges for all of us. So although pediatric illness is less common and less severe, it does occur. Not only that, but children under the age of 18 constitute 22% of the population. So when we talk about trying to achieve herd immunity, it's important to include them because we will need those children to be vaccinated in order to achieve our goal of 70 to 85% herd immunity. Protecting children, of course, really importantly, will facilitate their return to school and sports, letting parents go back to work so that the economy opens back up, and getting back to normal for all of us. So I do think that pediatric vaccination is very important. But on the other hand, we do need to make sure that the pediatric vaccines are safe and that they're held to a really high bar. And that's what's happening now. So the Pfizer vaccine, which is under an EUA approval down to the age of 16, may soon be granted for that approval to be extended down to the age of 12. And experts are hoping that vaccine for children under the age of 12 might be achievable by late this year or early next year. Both Pfizer and Moderna are conducting trials in children down to the age of 6 months, and other companies have already embarked on their pediatric trials in younger children as well. So hopefully we will continue to have more vaccines for all of us in our armamentariums. So in summary, I would say COVID vaccines are safe and effective. Like every other medical intervention and vaccine, you want to weigh the risks and benefits. And I would say in almost all cases, the benefits of vaccination outweigh the risks. Our new vaccine platforms offer a lot of promise in terms of their technology. Side effects after these vaccines are common, but fortunately short-lived. The very rare side effects are being further evaluated currently. Vaccinating pregnant women can help keep them and potentially their babies safe. Pediatric vaccines will offer children protection and help us return to normal. So Kate, what questions do you have for me?
First of all, thank you so much. It is really, really important that all of us understand the science behind the vaccine, because this, did feel like it happened fast. And to know that none of the steps were skipped and no safety trials were skipped is such an important thing. If I can add one thing, because as a general pediatrician, I'm talking about vaccines all day long with parents and kids. And I will tell you that my patients' parents are so excited to be getting their COVID vaccine and are asking me every day when their kids can get vaccinated. That, one thing we talk about frequently, as you had mentioned, is side effects. And so one thing I always say is, hey, if you have a sore arm or if you have a low grade fever, that means your body's making antibodies. So that's obviously a positive spin to put on it, but it is good to know that, hey, yeah, it seems like the vaccine is being effective. And another point that you hit on that I just wanted to comment on as well, in terms of the exceedingly rare side effects. If we think about the side effects of actually getting the disease, and in this case, COVID-19, that side effects or having disease symptoms from getting the wild virus disease is huge and significant. So when we're talking about finding some side effects, number one, it's exceedingly rare. And number two, if there does seem to be some side effects that are linked to the vaccine, the medical community is watching so carefully and closely that it gets stopped and monitored very quickly. So truly, as you said, vaccines are safe. So as for a few questions, so these are things that have come into my office from parents and from community leaders. One of the things that I get asked is, concern about the variants, because we've seen variants show up since the pandemic has started, right? And especially more recently in the last number of months, coming from all over the world. And so the question I have is, do you have any concerns about these particular variations or mutations that are not covered by the vaccine?
So far, the variants that are circulating in this country should be covered by the vaccines. And so once again, it's important to get people vaccinated so that that virus can't replicate and can't mutate. It's also important to get people all over the world vaccinated, and that's a whole other conversation that's important, I think. But right now, today, I think that we will get coverage, particularly against severe disease, with the vaccines that we have.
Thank you. That's so important. And I think you made an excellent point about, a vaccine, if you get exposed to the virus when you've already been vaccinated, is it possible to still get some of the more common, less severe effects of COVID-19? I think it's always possible, but it's really those severe effects, keeping us out of the hospital, keeping us alive and healthy and off a ventilator, is really what we're going for. Another question I have, and this is really kind of a general question for vaccines, but in particular for COVID-19, getting vaccines when you might be already feeling under the weather. Maybe you're tired, maybe you've got a cold. Is that safe? And is it possible to overwhelm the immune system when you get a vaccine if you're already experiencing perhaps another virus?
Well, if you're experiencing moderate to severe symptoms, then your doctor will probably elect to defer vaccination. And as I said, if you have COVID or you may have COVID, you definitely want to wait until you're out of isolation to get your vaccine for the safety of those who are in the office. Other than that, though, you should go ahead and get vaccinated. And really, when you think about your immune system and how sophisticated it is, your immune system is handling onslaughts all day, every day, from many, many antigens. And it can certainly handle this one antigen that's being presented in the vaccines, the spike protein. So Yes, you should get vaccinated.
So another question is about for those of us who have been fortunate to get vaccinated, and for those who are fortunate to be vaccinated very soon, what is safe to do? Right, we're vaccinated, we're really excited and feeling confident that our risk of getting COVID-19 is significantly reduced, and yet we're still needing to mask. And so I think talking about what what can we do when we're vaccinated? How can we open up our world a little bit? Is, there's not one straight answer, right? It's all about mitigating risk, but I'd like to get your take on that for vaccinated persons.
I think that as vaccinated individuals go, we can feel better about certain situations. So we can feel better, for instance, about meeting with other vaccinated individuals and feeling confident that on both sides we're protected. We can also think about, opening up to our close relatives and friends and having a little bit more of that interaction than we've had in the past. I think that the things that we're still going to try to avoid are crowded indoor situations, basically. That's the bottom line for right now. But in terms of smaller interactions, I think that it really will help us get back to seeing our family and get back to some things for the kids like sports and other things that are so needed for their physical and mental health.
Absolutely. I think we've seen the toll this has taken this last year, particularly on our kids, and getting them back to normalcy, and seeing family members and seeing friends and getting up and off Zoom, and outside and exercising is really, really important for our community. So with that, and this is going to be the $1 million question, do you think that kids will be able to get their vaccines by the fall when schools open up everywhere, not just in Orange County, but all over California?
Well, I'm certainly hoping so, particularly for the older kids. And so when we think about risk, certainly the older kids seem to have more risk than younger kids in terms of transmission and disease. And that seems to be the cohort that's most likely to be vaccinated by the fall. So I'm hoping that that 12 to 15-year-old age group will be able to avail themselves of vaccination by then. And that'll be great.
Great. Yeah, I'm pretty hopeful too. So that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise with everyone here listening and the entire community. To everyone who's watching this video, make sure to continue to mask and hand wash and stay safe. And let's all get vaccinated as soon as we are able so we can open up Orange County and get our kids back to school, back to sports, and everyone back to normalcy. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.